Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan, and we're back to the David story, Shepherd, Father, King. We're going to lecture number 5 today, the tragedy of Saul. And we've been looking at, one of the themes that we've been looking at through the course is this tension between the personal and the political. Of course, we're talking here about David, and he's going to be a king. He was anointed king by Samuel. And we're seeing something that is, I think, characteristic of monarchies that is interesting to read here in the biblical text. And that is that you can't really separate the personal from the political. And I guess that happens in every regime. You can see in politicians today, it's very difficult for them to separate their personal lives from the political. It is especially the case when it comes to monarchies. I've been watching The Crown recently, which I guess is kind of an older show now, but I'm just getting to it. And you can see that there also, the sense of duty always for their political position, always above that of their personal lives. And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's a reality of that political regime that you see here in the text also. David struggles with that.
Sure, and Saul does as well. When Samuel warned the Israelites with a message from God of the dangers of a king, the danger of the king's personality is implied, his passions, his appetites, his wills, and we see that come to play in the tragedy of Saul. The story of Saul is somewhat reminiscent to the story of Pharaoh and his continually hardened heart. We see repeated chances for Saul to relent from his own will. We see repeated demonstrations of mercy from David, and yet Saul continues in his sin and folly, even at times when he recognizes his sin and folly and David's righteousness. This reminds me of Dr. Jackson's explanation of Pharaoh's heart being hardened during the plagues in the Exodus story, where Pharaoh will acknowledge the sovereignty of Moses as God, and yet will then again oppose him. So here's an example from the text. This is 1 Samuel 24, verses 18 through 21. And he, Saul, said to David, "You are more in the right than I, for it is you who have requited me good, whereas I have requited you evil. The Lord will repay you with good for what you have done for me this day. And so look, I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingship of Israel will stay in your hands." And yet not long after, Saul goes back after David out of envy, out of wounded pride. He continues to make mistakes that are damaging to the people of Israel as well as to himself, because he's failing to protect them as a king ought.
And that's probably maybe the superiority of David, that in the end, he always respects and honors Saul, despite his faults. One of the last things that David says in this, after the death of Saul, towards the end of this episode, he says, "Jonathan's bow did not retreat, and the sword of Saul never turned away empty." And Dr. Jackson's point here is that David, even to the end, gives Saul the place of prominence. He's honoring Saul. And of course, that could be, again, political. He knows that he needs to unify the kingdom, and so he's giving honor to Saul. Or it could be personal in the sense that he actually really personally respected Saul. Regardless, he's offering honor, which is what he should do.
Indeed, it could be that David is remembering, in a way Saul seems to forget, that God has appointed Saul to be king for that time. Though David has been anointed, it's not yet his time to ascend to the throne. And David is demonstrating an obedience that Saul will not in his own actions demonstrate.
If you're enjoying the course, we have tons of resources in our website. Go to hillsdale.edu/course. That's hillsdale.edu/course. You'll find many things there. Among them, you'll find our DVDs. If you donate to support the course with a $100 tax-deductible donation or more, we'll go ahead and send you a DVD of the course that you can watch at your home, with your study group, or even with your Sunday school class. And now let's turn to Dr. Jackson on Lecture 5, The Tragedy of Saul.
Last time, we ended when Saul was going after David. The Spirit of the Lord has come upon David and has departed Saul, and this has turned into a violent form of jealousy. The people loved David. They ascribed to Saul his thousands, but to David his tens of thousands. And Saul knows exactly what's going on, that the people love David, and Saul is concerned that in fact David is going to be the one who usurps the throne. Chapter 18, verse 12, and Saul was afraid of David, for the Lord was with him, but from Saul had turned away. And Saul removed him from his presence and set him as a captain of 1,000, and he led the troops into the fray. And David succeeded in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. And Saul saw that he was very successful, and he dreaded him. But all Israel and all Judah loved David, for he led them into the fray. And that line that all of Israel loved David just underscores precisely one of the main characteristics of David. He's loved by God, right? He's after God's own heart. He's loved by Jonathan. What we're going to see is he's loved by Michal. He's loved by Saul, we're told. He's loved by the people. David is this beloved man, and Saul sees this. In the line here, it's ambiguous. Why in the world would he put him as a captain of the troops? I think we have a couple of options here. One, Saul sees David as certainly someone who can help further his political reign. David's a valiant warrior. That's certainly one aspect of it. The people love David, so if Saul can align himself with David, perhaps the people won't pull away from Saul completely. That's fine. But I think there may be another aspect of this as well. Putting David out there on the front lines as captain of all these troops also puts him in harm's way. Let's keep putting David out there for the fight. Maybe this is part of Saul's idea of a way of getting rid of David. If he's so good at fighting, let's just keep putting him out there and let's see what happens. And in fact, this second option becomes exactly more explicit in the text as Saul keeps getting tripped up by his own plans to get rid of David. David simply becomes stronger. Verse 17, and Saul said to David, "Here is my eldest daughter, Merab. Her shall I give you as wife. Only be a valiant fellow for me and fight the battles of the Lord." And Saul had thought, "Let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." Here the text makes it explicit then what Saul is doing. Let's send David out to the battle lines and maybe the Philistines will get rid of my problem. And I think there's another connection we have to make here, and we'll see it in the next lecture. This is precisely David's strategy that he uses with Uriah. David doesn't want to take Uriah out himself personally after David impregnates Bathsheba. Rather, let him go to the front of the battle lines. Let somebody else's hand be against him so that my hand is not. This is precisely what Saul does. And I make this observation just to give you a foretaste of what we're going to be running into with David. If Saul here is a tragic figure, we see his downfall acting immorally against David, someone who's clearly an easy ally for him, then we must say this is the same thing that befalls David, though we'll see their motivations aren't the same. David's motivation seems simply to cover for his lustful misdeeds, whereas Saul's is about it's about rivalry. It's about jealousy. It's about trying to keep that power, even though he knows, as we highlighted in the last lecture, we know God has turned away from him. We know that Saul knows that the kingship is no longer his, and yet he's going to fight it till the end. And David said to Saul, "Who am I and who are my kin, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be the king's son-in-law?" And it happened at that time, for giving Merab, the daughter of Saul, to David, that she was given to Adriel as wife. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing was pleasing in his eyes. And there's just one detail here I want to highlight here. Michal, the daughter of Saul, loved David. Just pay attention to that phrase, Michal, the daughter of Saul. We are going to see a shift in this title for Michal between the daughter of Saul and the wife of David. Here, the daughter of Saul. But the most important detail here is Michal loved David. This doesn't seem to be that important of a detail, except for one thing. This is the only time in the Hebrew Bible where we're told that a woman loves a man. Michal's the only female character where there's agency on the part of the woman in loving this man. So Michal loved David. And of course, it should make sense to us. It should make sense to us is that if there were going to be one time in the Hebrew Bible where a woman says she loves a man, clearly it's got to be for David, because everybody loves David. And Saul thought, I shall give her to him, that she may be a snare to him, if that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Notice what Saul's doing here. He is going to be using his daughter as a political pawn, that she may be a snare to David, that ultimately let the Philistines come after him. But notice, she's already, even though we're just told for the first time and the only time in the Hebrew Bible that a woman loves a man, that idea of that love of David is now going to be used as this political tool. And this gets back to what I talked about earlier in the story of David, is that we start to see how the personal and the political just get completely ensnared. And this happens to be disastrous. There are certain things, I suppose, one is willing to do politically to build a kingdom, to have a stronghold, to secure certain things for the people. But what happens when there's something personal intertwined with that? What happens when it's one's daughter who loves a man and you're willing to use her as this kind of political pawn in all of this? We're going to see the ramifications of this later. And Saul said to David, through the second one you can be my son-in-law now. And Saul charged his servants, speak to David discreetly, saying, look, the king desires you, and all his servants love you. And now then become son-in-law to the king. And Saul's servants spoke these words in David's hearing, and David said, it is a light thing in your eyes to become son-in-law to the king, and I am a poor man and lightly esteemed. And Saul's servants told him, saying, words of this sort David has spoken. And Saul said, thus shall you say to David, the king has no desire for any bride price, except 100 Philistine foreskins, to take vengeance against the king's enemies. And Saul had devised to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. You can see Saul's plot coming to fruition here. Let him go and try to do this sort of thing for the bride price and see what happens to him. And Saul's servants told these words to David, and the thing was pleasing in David's eyes to become son-in-law to the king. And let's just stop there. To become son-in-law to the king, let's just go back a little bit. What does Saul know? He knows he's no longer going to be the king. He knows this, that God has his eye on another anointed one. We know this. We also know who is God's anointed one. Well, we know that. It's David. We watched him be anointed. So we know this. We know David knows this. So we know Saul knows that he's not to be the king, that it's getting taken away from him. We know that David knows he's the anointed one and is going to become the king. And so there has to be lots of political intrigue here. We know that Saul knows that the people love David, and he's quite frightful that the people are going to turn to David's side. And so where we think there's this great political tension, and obviously there is. Saul's trying to kill David, not by his own hand, though he does throw spears at him. But what we know is that Saul sees David as an enemy. But what's David's response to this? If David knows he's to be the anointed, I am going to say perhaps something a little bit radical here. David, oftentimes in criticism, people like to see his scheming in all things. And by the way, rightfully so. He plays the madman. He wipes out an entire village. In 2 Samuel chapter 27, wipes him out, makes sure no one can actually report what he's done. He is a good schemer. He's a scrapper. He knows how to survive. And oftentimes what we want to do is ascribe all of that to what David's doing here in response to Saul, that this is some part of political scheming. Great. And I'll put that on the table. You can decide if that's the direction you want to go. But let me at least give maybe a slightly more sympathetic reading with David, and perhaps, I guess I would argue, a slightly more politically astute. If David is politically astute, and he is, there's no question about this, then let me offer a second reading. If David knows he's the anointed, and he does, then there are two ways of going about doing this. The first way is Saul's way, which is, you want a war, I'll give you a war. Perhaps David doesn't want this. This is going to rip the kingdom apart. In fact, we know it's going to rip the kingdom apart because that's what happens. What if you do this, if you're David, politically astute David? I'll marry his daughter. I will be his right-hand man. I will make him victorious in battle. I will be obedient to the Lord's anointed, because that's what Saul is. Even though I know, David, I know I'm the anointed, but I will do this peacefully. And what's the way in which I can become the anointed peacefully without laying hands on the anointed right now, that is to say, Saul? Well, what's the easiest solution to this? You just marry his daughter. Now you're son-in-law to the king. You have all the troops on your side. Wouldn't this be the most politically astute thing David could do, would be to live peacefully in a united kingdom under Saul until Saul gets old and dies? Wouldn't this be the solution to all of the problems? It seems to me very easily it could be. Of course, Saul is not going to let this happen, but there doesn't have to be scheming here. This could actually be a very peaceful way out of all this mess. And it also will make sense of David's language later. In other words, I'm asking us to do something pretty radical here, to read the text charitably and see David as an honest broker in this scene. Not someone going up against Saul, someone who's obviously politically powerful, who knows he's the Lord's anointed, and yet to carve out that space for Saul out of respect. Respect for Saul's person, respect for Saul as king, and respect for Saul as God's anointed. And the time was not done when David arose and went, and he and his men, and he struck down among the Philistines 200 men, and David brought their foreskins and made a full count to the king, to become son-in-law to the king. And Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, his wife. And Saul saw and marked that the Lord was with David, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, loved him. The second time that we're told this, and notice what he says. He knows that the Lord is on David's side. And so we know what's the easiest solution. Great Saul, be king. Raise David to be king. Do you see how easy this is? The succession narrative is just right here. But what do we let get in the way? Petty jealousy. The people ascribe to him 10. He has the second line in Hebrew poetry. This is why I hate David, because it seems to me there's nothing here to indicate David wants the kingdom to be taken away from Saul. He wants no harm to come to Saul. It's Saul who's bound up in this political intrigue, which, by the way, that should have been one of the warnings Samuel gave to Saul, gave to all of the people, that it may turn out if you want a king, he'll just simply want to be a king for the sake of being a king, as opposed to being this model of justice and righteousness. And Saul was all the more afraid of David. And here's the line for you. And Saul became David's constant enemy. And the Philistine captain sallied forth, and whatever they sallied forth, David succeeded more than all Saul's servants, and his name became greatly esteemed. This need not be a cause of fear for Saul. This can be a cause of celebration, because it's his son-in-law now. This could in fact be Saul's line. This could be Saul's heritage here with David. But he won't allow it to be so. In fact, we really do see this, of course, is the beginning of the downfall of Saul. But for me, the true downfall of Saul, as he goes after David, Jonathan takes up David's part. Michal helps David escape. Jonathan's telling David what Saul's plans are. Jonathan's trying to act as a mediator between Saul and David, but ultimately siding with David. So if you think about it, Saul's now lost his 2 children to David, because Saul can only see this in terms of political rivalry. He's making them choose. It's either I or David. But it need not be this way. And this is where we see the downfall of Saul. Again, simple farm boy, where we began his story. He's confused about what to do, looking for his father's cattle. He's afraid of worrying his father. That's where we began. The man who would be king, chosen by lots, hiding behind the gear. We now turn to chapter 22, verse 17, as he appeals to Ahimelech, the priests, and he knows that they're siding with David. And again, in Saul's world, you are either siding with me or you're siding with David. You are to give no comfort to David. Verse 17, He's there with Doeg the Edomite, a foreigner. And the king said to the sentries poised in attendance on him, "Turn around and put to death the priests of the Lord, for their hand too is with David. For they knew he was fleeing and did not reveal it to me." And the king's servants did not want to reach out their hand to stab the priests of the Lord. Think about what Saul has done here. The man who would be priest, Saul, the man who would be priest, who seems to be so concerned with calling a fast and obeying the Lord, trying to define what is the Lord's will in this battle. Should I go out there, Lord? The man who takes on this prophetic and priestly role. Now what does he do? He tells his sentry, kill the priests. And they refuse to do it. And he said to Doeg, you then turn around and stab the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned around, and it was he who stabbed the priest, and he put to death on that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. And he struck down Nob, the priest's town, with the edge of the sword, man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and donkey and sheep, all by the edge of the sword. For me, this is the ultimate downfall of Saul. He's done. I'm just personally, not in terms of his kingship. Let's just for a moment forget about that. Just personally, the man is wrecked. This was a man who wanted to be a man of God, to divine the will of God. And now look what's happened. He allows this foreign entity to slaughter all of the priests. And to me, there's a perfect bookendedness to his downfall. Biblical literature, of course, as we know, it loves its parallel scenes, right? Saul trying to figure out how to kill David without using his own hand will be exactly what David tries to do. That's how the authors bring these scenes together. But in this one, what do we have with Saul? What was the reason that he lost his kingship? Do you recall? When he would not put to death the king of the Amalekites. When he wouldn't wipe out everyone, but he kept some of the choice flocks for himself and the troops. Remember this? He wouldn't slaughter them all. And now, for me, this is the moment of Saul's absolute decline. This is it. He's at the bottom. What does he do? He goes into Nob, the priest town, and what does he do? He slaughters everything. He does to the priests of Israel precisely what he would not do to the Amalekites. And the Amalekites stand as this kind of eternal enemy of Israel, the tribe that attacked them after the Exodus when they're in the wilderness. He wouldn't do precisely what the Lord commanded him to do there, and now what does he go and do to mark his downfall? He slaughters all of the priests. I want us to take a look now at chapter 24 and chapter 26, because they are these double parallel reconciliation scenes. There's a place where we get to see Saul and David for the last time interact with one another. We get to see the return after Saul's been chasing down David. And we get to see what David's response is to all of this. And it happened, chapter 24, and it happened when Saul turned back from the Philistines that they told him, saying, look, David is in the wilderness. And please mark this. In chapter 24, it's Saul's men who see David and want to go after David. And Saul took 3,000 picked men from all Israel, and he went to seek David over the rocks of the wild goats. And he came to the sheepfolds along the way, and there was a cave there. And Saul went in to relieve himself, while David and his men were sitting in the far end of the cave. And David's men said to him, here is the day that the Lord said to you, look, I am about to give your enemy into your hands, and you may do to him whatever seems good in your eyes. And David rose stealthily and cut off the skirt of the cloak that was Saul's. And it happened then that David was smitten with remorse because he had cut off the skirt of the cloak that was Saul's. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid me that I should have done this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to reach out my hand against him, for he is the Lord's anointed. I just want to stop here. Well, look at what David says to his men, that what he's done is wrong, the cutting of Saul's cloak. And I hope everyone can now appreciate that cloak imagery that we've seen throughout. All you need to do is think back to Saul holding on to Samuel's cloak and tearing it. And I think that's why we get this imagery here. It's supposed to remind us when he tore away Samuel's cloak, what was it an indication of? that the Lord has torn your kingship away from you, Saul. What do you see here? David tearing the cloak. And you're thinking, this is Saul's kingship being torn away from him by David. Beautiful parallelism. But what does David do? Shockingly for me, he rejects that sort of parallel structure. He rejects it. He's saddened by it. He's remorseful. What does he call Saul? Look at the violence I've done to what? The Lord's anointed. That's really, for me, it's a stunning moment to see David's thought process here. And David held back his men with words and did not let them rise against Saul. And Saul rose from the cave and went on the way. And David then rose and came out of the cave and called after Saul, saying, "My Lord the king," look at those lines, "My Lord the king." What's David doing? He's letting Saul understand how David sees himself in relationship to Saul, which is my Lord and King, which is to say, I have complete and total solidarity with you, fidelity with you. There isn't a rivalry here. I'm not trying to overtake you. You're chasing me down. And Saul looked behind him, and David knelt his face to the ground and bowed down. Complete image of submission and respect. And David said to Saul, "Why should you listen to people's words saying, 'Look, David seeks to harm you'? Look, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord is giving you into my hand in the cave, and they meant to kill you. And I had pity for you and said, I will not reach out my hand against my master, for he is the Lord's anointed." Makes all this admission to Saul, trying to dispel whatever this rivalry is. And now here are the next lines. "And my father," my father. So now let's get beyond the political, lay out all the political there. You're the Lord's anointed and you're my Lord and my King. I bow down to you in submission. Now look at the language. My father, he's going from the political to the personal here. And let us not forget that Saul loved David. See the skirt of your cloak in my hand, for when I cut off the skirt of your cloak and did not kill you, mark and see that there was no evil or crime in my hand. And I did not offend you, yet you stalked me to take my life. Let the Lord judge between me and you, and the Lord will avenge me of you, but my hand will not be against you."
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
As the proverb of the ancient says, "From wicked men does wickedness come forth, but my hand will not be against you. After whom is the king of Israel come forth? After whom are you chasing? After a dead dog, after a single flea? The Lord will be arbiter and judge between me and you. And he may see and plead my case and judge me against you." And it happened when David had finished speaking these words to Saul that Saul said, "Is this your voice?" And here it is, "My son David." He responds to David's call of "my father" with "David, my son." And Saul raised his voice and wept. And he said to David, "You are more in the right than I." And if you recall from the Genesis story, when Judah says to Tamar as she confronts him, he says, "She is more in the right than I am." It's the same phrasing here. "For it is you who requited me good, whereas I requited you evil. And you told today how you wrought good with me, and when the Lord delivered me into your hand, you did not kill me. For if a man finds his enemy, does he send him away off on a good way? The Lord will repay you with good, and what you have done for me this day. And so look, I know that you will surely be king, and the kingship of Israel will stay in your hands. And now swear to me by the Lord that you shall not cut off my seed after me. You shall not blot out my name from my father's house. And David swore to Saul, and Saul went home while David and his men went up to the stronghold. Look at that. The Lord will repay you for good with what you have done for me today. He sees David's kindness, admits to David's kindness, admits that he's in the wrong and that David is in fact in the right. It's a beautiful reconciliation scene. And in fact, so beautiful, we're going to see it again in chapter 26 with this parallel episode, and I'll let the critics fight it out as to whether or not these are two authors giving us an account of the same scene, or rather if they're consciously bringing in this paired scene, because there are differences in the reconciliation. In this first one, they see where David's going. But in the second scene, it's David in chapter 26, verse 4, David who sends his spies and sees Saul. And the one difference that we see here, the one difference we see is that David doesn't cut off his cloak this time. Rather, he takes his spear and his water jug. So if we do have two accounts of the same episode, and it does seem weird to have two reconciliation scenes, I'll admit it. If we're trying to treat this as chapter 24, chapter 25, which is the Abigail scene, chapter 26, to have a complete repetition of a reconciliation scene with almost the same language, seems odd to me if we're looking for accurate unfolding of chronological events. But it doesn't seem odd if we're to read it as just a basic notion of reconciliation, beautiful language between the two. And even more to the point, look at what David does to prove his fidelity. On the one hand, he cuts the cloak, which I pointed out previously, is a wonderful reaching back to the Samuel scenes and all of the cloak imagery. But then we get the second one, the taking of the spear. Well, why take the spear? Well, because in the first act of violence of Saul, what does he do? He throws a spear at David's head. He does this a couple of times. So what we get in these parallel scenes is David rejecting Saul's violence. He cuts the cloak, and there's remorse for this, of doing this violence against the king. He takes the spear, this very instrument that was cast at his head in Saul's house. What does he do? He takes it away and says, I won't use it. It would be a perfect form of revenge, would it not? I mean, if you're writing this and want this perfect parallelism with regards to revenge, how ought David kill Saul? Oh, take the spear that was hurled at your head and put it right through Saul's temple. That would be the easiest way. But what David shows in both of these scenes is that he's going to reject this. Chapter 26, verse 21, when Saul calls back out to David, Saul says, I have offended. Come back, my son. And this is the second time in this scene that he calls David my son. Come back, my son David, for I will not harm you again, inasmuch as my life was precious in your eyes this day. I have played the fool and have erred gravely. And David answered and said, here is the king's spear. Let one of the lads come over and take it, and the Lord will pay back to a man his right actions and his loyalty. For the Lord gave you today into my hand, and I did not want to reach out my hand against the Lord's anointed. And look, just as I valued your life today, may the Lord value my life highly, and may he save me from every strait. And Saul said to David, blessed are you, my son David. You shall surely do much. You shall surely win out. Look at that. You shall surely do much, and you shall surely win out. You shall surely win out are Saul's last words to David. Saul has reconciled himself, I think, that this is just the way it's going to play out, that David shall be king, that David is the anointed. Saul is the anointed, but clearly he understands where this is going. And David went on his way, but Saul returned to his place. And of course, we see that Saul isn't quite done. He will go and visit in chapter 28 a necromancer, the ghost wife of Endor, and he asks her to call up Samuel. It's this nice kind of bookend to the end of Saul's story, because this is the end of Saul's story. It's a perfect bookend because he relies on Samuel again one more time. Ask Samuel, please tell me what's going to happen. And Samuel tells him, you are going to die, and your sons are going to die at the hand of the Philistines. And one of the nifty details here as we conclude the story of Samuel and Saul, as Saul calls Samuel up from the dead, is that Samuel's still wearing the cloak that his mother made for him. It's just this perfect little touch. If there is a hallmark of their artistry, it is just nifty little touches like this, to have Samuel continuing to wear that cloak one more time. And of course, Saul is told he's going to die, and he's going to die at the hand of the Philistines. And in fact, he does. Chapter 31, we get the death of Saul, verse 3. The Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul, and the battle went heavy against Saul. And the archers, the bowmen, found him, and he quaked with fear of the archers. And Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and run me through and abuse me." But the armor bearer did not want to do it, because he was very frightened. And Saul took the sword and fell upon it. And the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, and he too fell upon his sword and died with him. And the Philistines take his corpse and they desecrate it. They hang it around their encampment. And of course, the Israelites are going to return to go and get it. But this is the end of 1 Samuel. And we begin 2 Samuel with the report of Saul's death to David. And the poor young man who comes to tell David what he has done, he reports to David that I am an Amalekite. And David said to the lad who had told him, and the lad makes up a story about how he himself had finished off Saul, which is a big mistake. 1, you're an Amalekite, enemy of Israel. 2, you've just reported that you've laid your hand on Saul. And what the Amalekite, what he's thinking is, I will get into the king's favor. The king will give me rewards because I took down his enemy. What he doesn't know is chapters 24 and 26, that David loves Saul and respects the anointed, that he wouldn't put his hand on Saul. And now the Amalekite is saying he did such a thing. And David said to him, verse 14, "How were you not afraid to reach out your hand to do violence to the Lord's anointed?" And David called to one of the lads and said, "Come forward, stab him." Look how quick that is. Come forward, stab him. And he struck him down and he died. And David said to him, "Your blood is on your own head, for your mouth bore witness against you, saying, I was the one who finished off the Lord's anointed." And look what David allows for there. He allows to continue to call Saul the Lord's anointed. And I think here David's being quite faithful to Saul. In fact, in his lamentation, this is 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 22. "From the blood of the slain, from the warrior's fat, Jonathan's bow did not retreat, and the sword of Saul never turned away empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and dear, in their life and their death, they were never parted." And I just simply want to conclude this lecture today with simple 2 lines from this poem I just read to you. "Jonathan's bow did not retreat, and the sword of Saul never turned away empty." Remember, Saul killed his thousands and David killed his tens of thousands. With regards to parallelism and expansion, it's always the second unit that has the place of prominence. What does David do? Jonathan, whom he loves much, whom he praises in this lamentation, heaps great love upon Jonathan here. But look at what he says. "Jonathan's bow did not retreat, and the sword of Saul never turned away empty." He gives Saul that place of prominence. And we see as David becomes the king, David, the Lord's anointed, that he pays homage and love and respect to Saul. And will we say, oh, this is a great political ploy? Of course we can say that. David's going to try to unite the kingdom after Saul is dead. And he has a tough road ahead of him to do so. But for a moment, I want us to not, and I know it's difficult, but maybe not think politically. But think for a moment, maybe David means it. Maybe he does see Saul as a father. Maybe he did love Saul. Saul certainly loved David. Maybe there is respect and there is this love for Saul. And maybe we can go back to chapter 24 and 26 and look at their reconciliation. And so in the next lecture, we will look at David unifying the kingdom after the death of Saul, trying to cure all of the hardship, the animosities, to bring Saul's loyal people into David's camp. We will see the rise of David's kingdom, a time of peace. And maybe that's the ultimate temptation for David, that time of peace, because we will also start to see the descent of David, his own giving in to temptations, and the introduction of his own kingdom's decline.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale College Online Courses podcast. If you want to continue learning about the David story or other topics, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There, you will find over 40 free online courses including ancient Christianity, the Genesis story, classic children's literature, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that what you'll learn will enrich your life and that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.